Great. Well, I'm going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining us today to talk about communities, natural capital and carbon credits. It's a really hot topic at the moment, and we've had a huge amount of interest in various webinars we've run on this topic recently. I'm really pleased to welcome three colleagues today who've got a huge amount of experience in this sector. Jon Hollingdale, who many of you know from Community Woodland Association, James McDougall from the Woodland Trust, and I'm really pleased today that Charlie Davis from Savills is joining us, and Charlie and I haven't met before, so welcome Charlie. We're really looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and the work that you're doing here. The plan today is to hear from Charlie, James and Jon, and then we'll have some questions. And then we're really keen for everyone that's on the call to have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So the session will last for 1.5 hours absolute max. We'll be finished by 16:30. We've got a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you could use that to ask any questions, and we'll keep an eye on those questions as the presentations go on, and I'll be picking some of those up to answer at the end. We do have captions available for those that want a live transcript, and if you need assistance in turning that on, put a note in the chat box and Christina will help you out with that. And then in the chat function, please use that to introduce yourself, to give us a bit of detail about where you've come from and what your interest is, share any comments, any questions to others in the session today. But as I say, if you can focus actual Q&A questions for our three panelists today in the Q&A function, we'll be able to keep a close eye on that. So if you do have any technical support requirements while we're ongoing, if you're struggling with audio or video, we have got 3 presentations today, so if you've got problems, please message Christina in the chat box and she'll be able to help you out. So that's the general introduction. I'm going to introduce first Charlie from Savills, and Charlie's part of the rural management team at Savills. She's based in Perth, and Charlie's a founder member of the Savills Natural Capital team for Scotland. She's a land manager, got a background in conservation and sustainability, and she supports rural businesses, the management of rural businesses in Scotland, with a focus on management of the natural environment and landscape, for biodiversity, carbon sequestration and a just transition, really important to all of us. Now Charlie works with a range of private, institutional, corporate and community bodies to deliver large-scale habitat creation and restoration schemes, and she particularly specialises in identifying and measuring co-benefits. So we're really interested to hear about some of that today. Creating nature-based solution partnerships to facilitate land use change. She also advises investors in nature-based solution on their corporate social responsibility to communities and stakeholders. So hopefully we'll get some questions for Charlie on how that works in the Q&A box. Some of the projects include landscape scale mixed habitat creation, carbon resource management, whole estate environmental management planning, habitat restoration and whole business carbon auditing. So a huge range of work that Charlie is involved with. So I'm going to pass over to you, Charlie, for you to start sharing your screen if that's okay, and for you to kick off the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilse. That's fantastic. Hopefully you can see my screen. Just nod if you can see my screen. Thank you. It's always good to get some confirmation. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining, and thank you for having me. It's a huge honour to be involved, and this is a really fascinating area, and it's an area that really takes up most of my time as part of the Savills Natural Capital team, and as a rural business manager. So hopefully I'll be able to, in this session, talk about some of the opportunities, and also maybe do a little bit of myth busting just from kind of the commercial side, having seen a lot of these transactions take place, and talk about what some of them look like and how they might be able to benefit, how community groups might be able to benefit from these emerging markets, but also how really the environment can benefit, which is, as we know, the main driver. Yeah, again, a bit of background, and Ilse set me up really well there, so thank you. But I'm part of the Savills Natural Capital team in Scotland, and we're made up of rural business managers who specialise in advising clients on the environmentally led management of their natural assets. And though I'm primarily a rural business manager, as Ilse said, my background is really in sustainability and conservation. And we really want to help support rural businesses who are taking seriously the need to adopt responsible environmental management. And the question for all of them and for all of us is how to access support for this work in the form of funding and expertise and resources. So we all have a part to play, as we now appreciate, in mitigating the climate and biodiversity crisis, and funding for land use change towards more climate resilient and land management is increasingly available through government and charitable grants, as we know. But these can be quite competitive, they can be quite prescriptive, and they can offer only kind of short-term stimulus funding sometimes. And we all know how it feels to have to begin hunting for the next lot of funding as soon as one lot has been secured. So from my perspective, the private market for ecosystem services really offers an alternative in for landowning organisations who want to enact environmental change and to fund that change in the long term while meeting often broader environmental and social aims that they might have as part of their organisation. So what is the market for environmental outcomes, and who wants them and why, I suppose, is a good opening question. And I'm going to try and resist teaching you all to suck eggs because you'll know a lot about this. But broadly, from my perspective, the nature-based solutions market is really a mechanism by which the delivery of ecosystem services are privately funded. And it's the market response to a kind of society-wide appetite for action to be taken to combat the climate and biodiversity crisis. And natural capital markets are effectively a way that society can vote for land management for nature and climate resilience by deciding where they invest and spend their money, whether that's where they keep their pension or which supermarket they shop in and what products they buy when they're in the supermarket, or even where they choose to study. We work with academic institutions and things like that. So it's part of all of these decisions, market decisions that people are making. And companies are really alive to this, and they want to meet their stakeholders' demand for them to demonstrate verifiable, permanent environmental change and show that they're contributing to environmental outcomes, either through net zero pledges that we've seen a lot of in the news, or more sophisticated schemes to give back to nature. And you might have heard of nature recovery targets that are now emerging as part of these aims. So the demand for nature-based solutions is growing, and in this emergent voluntary market, the prices that organisations are willing to pay for those that can supply these verifiable environmental goods are rising rapidly as demand really outstrips supply. So what does this really look like? It looks hopefully something like this. But at the moment we have two mechanisms, and again, you'll all know this, but two mechanisms for the certification of tradable environmental outcomes. We've got the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code. They offer an objective set of standards that ensure that any carbon sequestered or avoided through the schemes are real, permanent, and delivered in a responsible way. So land managers can undertake woodland creation or peatland restoration either in isolation or, I think more excitingly, within wider habitat creation schemes, and for that receive payments from third parties for ecosystem services that those land use decisions are delivering, as long as they're certified under the code. And for landowning environmentally motivated community groups in Scotland, these markets, combined with the public grant funding that we know is available through FGS, the Forest Grant Scheme, and Peatland Action, can really facilitate the creation or restoration not only of these specific habitats, but also offer a surplus for long-term funding that can contribute to other objectives that those groups might have. Now, it'd be remiss of me not to address some of the concerns, and I think this is really in response to Jon's fantastic paper about some of the things that we need to think about when we're thinking about these markets and not just get overexcited. So I'm just going to address some of these. There is a very real concern that carbon markets will lock people out of land ownership by inflating prices. And we've seen a number of these kind of acquisitions take place in the last 12 months. Where corporations are looking to lock in a supply of offsets, either for sale or for their own internal reporting for acquiring land. But increasingly, hopefully this will be of some comfort, having conversations with large emitters almost every day of the week, they are realising that the market to purchase land on which to deliver ecosystem services is incredibly constrained, as we all know. And the returns they might get from carbon, frankly, pale in comparison to the commercial asset investments that they're used to seeing. They're worried that purchasing and having that on their balance sheet, a piece of land on their balance sheet where they don't have any land management expertise, and they often, pieces of land come with other assets that come with liabilities themselves, and that they just aren't set up to deal with, means that the whole thing carries way too much risk in terms of acquisition. So the reality that we're seeing is a bit of a shift, but it is that actually very few emitters will end up acquiring land for that purpose. And instead, the conversations we're having is that, that they're looking for people who currently occupy the land, like yourselves, to be the ones to deliver climate and biodiversity positive schemes. And that means that depending on the agreement which is reached, and that's where we come in to help with drafting these agreements so that they're equitable, and emitters and landowning organisations, those between those two parties, it means that those organisations can retain ownership of the ground, but also participate actively in the design and delivery of the schemes on the ground, ensuring that they meet their own environmental and social objectives. So that's a positive. Another big question around offsetting, because this is what we're really talking about, let's call a spade, we're talking about offsetting, is that can allow business as usual to continue by emitters who really want to avoid making real changes to their operations. But given what we've just said about partnerships and the fact that people are going to have to find partnerships in order to deliver these schemes, really emitters are in the market for land-owning organisations to partner with to deliver nature-based solutions. And that means that land-owning organisations have the discretion to choose who to create links with. And those links need to be with credible partners who can demonstrate the rigour of their own sustainability or ESG strategies and have demonstrably reduced, before they offset, any environmental impacts of their operations. The ball is in land managers' court here, which is exciting, because they will undertake the due diligence to decide whom they want to trade with and whom they want to collaborate with. And as we understand increasingly, the extent to which demand outstrips supply in the market, really that means that landowners can be pretty discerning about who they want to sign up to agreements with. And some of the early movers maybe are regretting decisions that they made to jump into bed with people that they maybe are now questioning. But for the people we're talking to now who are considering this very carefully and become increasingly sophisticated, are thinking very, very carefully about who they partner up with. And the fantastic thing about that is that it contributes to the integrity of the whole offsetting market in Scotland, and it pushes up the quality of the deals that are being done and the quality of the units that are being created. So pretty positive from my perspective. And I've just put in some of the co-benefits that might be things that are considered as part of those partnership agreements, because where we sit here in Scotland is quite a boutique market in terms of carbon offsets. It's a high standards that we have globally for the verification of units, nature-based carbon removal, delivering all sorts of other ecosystem services. The people who are coming to look to buy in this market are expecting to pay more than off-the-shelf units, and they're also expecting that the schemes that they get involved in are going to deliver more than just tons of carbon. They usually have quite sophisticated ESG frameworks which want to deliver on environment, social, governance objectives, and they want to see that all built into this partnership. So as well as striving for the highest possible ecological and climate outcomes, really they're looking to demonstrate real engagement with the socio-economic impacts of their schemes, involvement with local communities, delivery of opportunities and resilience to those local communities, which is really, really positive step for the market. So the land managers we work with are really embracing the fact that they're participating in an increasingly discerning marketplace, and that's reflected in the care that they're taking in the design and delivery of land management, that really ticks all of the boxes in terms of wider environmental outcomes for biodiversity, landscape resilience, connectivity, social outcomes, employment, local communities. They're really mindful of these things, which is really, really exciting. And they have to be if they work with us, frankly, because we hammer it home pretty strongly. And as with all issues, and I don't want to be naive about this, there's huge variation in the approaches that are taken. But what I think is fundamental here is that a partnership model allows you to retain control over the quality of the deliverables of any scheme that you might undertake. And my last negative issue that we probably need to address is that people are concerned that offsetting schemes have a narrow focus on carbon to the detriment of other outcomes. The concern is that really carbon schemes will push out the mosaic of land uses and rural industries that create diversity within the landscape and opportunities for employment and resilient occupation, such as commercial forestry or agriculture or traditional livelihoods. And you've probably all seen this graphic, which I think is quite compelling, with all of these other things being ignored and a focus on carbon. But from my perspective, private funding through the sale of ecosystem services really offers communities an opportunity to fund their habitat creation and restoration, as well as other ecosystem services for which there probably isn't yet a market, such as soil carbon capture, heathland habitat creation, freshwater habitat enhancement or creation, water quality, water attenuation, all of these things that we used to, community provisions like leisure and education, extensive agricultural practices, other low impact industries. There's scope for all of this within these schemes if they're done right, effectively. So it's the role really of project design and consultation to make sure that the schemes are suitable for the site in terms of land use and impact, and the impact of that changing land use, and the impact that has on communities and ecology. And I think that getting this right it can actually increase diversity in the land uses that occupy a certain area. We're talking about native woodland on marginal sites here. Timber prices mean that if you can grow commercial crops, then people are growing commercial crops. We're talking about marginal land that probably has been occupied by sport or sheep grazing, and actually returning some of that native woodland habitat to those areas can only be a benefit to diversity if it's done in the right way, and care really needs to be taken to ensure that these schemes are participating in a just transition towards climate resilience and mitigation. So from my perspective, markets for ecosystem services really offer an opportunity for community land managers, and despite Scotland's national climate pledges and planting targets, there really isn't enough public funding to support the change that we need to see at scale to sort out the environmental situation that we find ourselves in. And a discerning, quality-driven private market, I think, has a chance to inject new life and new opportunities for positive change and real sustainability into Scotland's rural economy. And when I say sustainability, I don't just mean environmental sustainability, I mean economic sustainability as well. And we talked about discerning buyers with wider ESG goals, and we know from conversations with institutional and corporate emitters that they're aware of the politically charged nature of land ownership and land use in Scotland, and they'd be keen to partner with and financially support the goals of organisations that reflect a different kind of land ownership model in Scotland, frankly. This has a political side to it as well, and they're looking for those opportunities, and we're looking to match make those kind of opportunities. So there really are some benefits that we see for community landowners in participating in these markets. And just to run through some of them again, there's an opportunity here for community landowners to receive an income while retaining autonomy and control, like I said. There's also an opportunity, which I think is really important, to retain control over their cash flow and manage more sustainably their income for wider work than really grants and subsidies can allow for, because they can have a carbon sales strategy. And that could mean short-term funding through the sale of PRU, pending issuance units at the beginning of a scheme, or periodic injections of income through sale at point of verification, or holding off and seeing what happens to the carbon price. But it's a choice, and it's going to suit different organisations to do different things, and that autonomy is really, really important. Also see that there being a benefit for the platform and the publicity that partnerships can bring if they're partnered with the right people, if they're really, really credible organisations that the society recognise as being, whether that's charities or institutions, that could potentially be really, really beneficial for community groups. And there are all sorts of other benefits to partnerships. We see people getting R&D funding from their partners to help them do some of the monitoring and the surveying that they want to do on these sites. We see academic institutions running PhDs on the basis on these sites. We see schools participating and sending students to these sites. It's really, there's an endless list really of potential co-benefits that could come from these partnerships, and they all need to be considered when you're thinking about who to partner with. That being said, there are barriers that we have to recognise for community groups entering the market, and we frankly haven't seen many community landowners embarking on schemes, and we'd like to see more. And I suppose the perennial issue that it would be remiss not to mention here is that really you can only do this, you can only embark on these schemes if you've got access to land, and that's the key issue that we face in Scotland. And you can only deliver environmental outcomes if you have control over that land. So that's a significant barrier to entry for community groups to do this. There's also quite a big commitment in these schemes. There's a commitment of between 30 and 100 years typically. And if you've got a fluid management structure within your community group, then that can feel like quite a big commitment, and certainly is, because it comes with management obligations. And there may be a nervousness around drafting these partnership agreements in a way that's going to be equitable and stand the test of time, and putting together a sales strategy for these carbon credits that's going to benefit organisations. And finally, where do they find credible partners? This is a barrier for community groups. They need to be hooked up with these credible partners. It's all very well talking about it, but where are they going to meet them? But I don't think any of these are unsurmountable, with the right advice and the right resources. And hopefully part of what we're doing here today is giving people a bit of a confidence boost in the fact that they can enter these markets. And I really do see these key benefits for community groups in finding an alternative route for funding environmental land management, retaining control over the land, and getting co-benefits from partnerships. And what really our experience tells us is that emitters we speak to, who are increasingly informed and sophisticated in the way that they're approaching these schemes, and land managers who again are demonstrating increasing sophistication in the deals that they're willing to strike, is that these relationships are really best if they're long-term collaborations over a shared set of environmental objectives that deliver a suite of measurable environmental outcomes over time, and that they're founded on integrity and shared objectives, and really a holistic approach to land management, and responsible approach to land management that's going to stand the test of time. And that means incorporating both the social and the economic as well as environmental outcomes of a scheme. And I think that's possible. I see it happen, and we just need a bit more of it. So I'm keen that we facilitate that where possible. I don't want to run over time, so I'm going to leave it there, but I'm really looking forward to picking up on some of these ideas in more detail in our discussion. There's so much to talk about in this topic, and I'm sure we'll have a lively debate, because I'm interested to hear perspectives from different ends of the spectrum, from different perspectives on how this is emerging. But that's me.
Brilliant, Charlie. That was great. A very passionate presentation there. You can tell how much you love the topic, and as you say, there's a huge amount to talk about in it. So thank you so much for that. And I think you made a couple of good points there about the political backdrop being quite important, and emitters and people that are looking to buy carbon offsets really starting to recognise that. And I'm sure there'll be some questions about that later. And of course, the other key issue is about one of the main barriers is access to land. And of course, the market is moving in such a way now that actually it's very difficult for communities to access land. So hopefully we'll get a couple of thoughts on that later on. So, but thank you for that. Now, you also mentioned partnership, and I'm going to introduce James McDougall now. And James has been working in this sector for a while. He's first and foremost a forester. He worked with the Forestry Commission across Scotland for 30 years, can't believe it, before joining the Woodland Trust 2 years ago. And since joining the Trust, James has been instrumental in developing their carbon offer in Scotland, and has been working really closely with a number of communities, including one very close to my heart, the Isle of Egg Heritage Trust, in developing plans and securing funding. So I'm going to pass over to James now, and James will give you some background as to the really fantastic work that Woodland Trust are doing in this area. Thanks, James.
Thanks very much, Ailsa. There's always one presenter who has a problem with technology on these things, so I'm relying very heavily on Christina to get me through my various slides here. So if you see me nodding my head, it's not that I'm falling asleep on my own presentation. It's I just need the next one to come up. I mean, what a fantastic sort of segue between Charlie and myself. I mean, she mentioned credible partners, and open the door, in comes the Woodland Trust. What a fantastic credible partner we could be for communities. And what I'd like to do just now is just talk you through a number of ways that the Woodland Trust has worked with communities, essentially through the Woodland Carbon Code, and how that's benefited both communities and ourselves. So next one, Christina. So I'm going to run through just a number of slides, who the Woodland Trust is, Next one, what our carbon offer is. Next one, we're going to highlight 3 community projects that we've done. They are the Island of Egg, the Asset Foundation, and the project down at Langham. And I'm just going to finish off with what I consider to be some of our USPs, which, you know, just show the benefits of our attitude and our flexibility towards community engagement and working with communities. So who is the Woodland Trust? Well, we're the largest native woodland charity in the UK. Well, we're the largest woodland charity in the UK. And this is a very special year for us. This is our 50th anniversary. So we've got a little bit of a track record in terms of our work with land managers, work on our own estate, and building relationships. So essentially, I guess we are land managers and relationship managers. We have relationships through corporates worth multi-million-pound deals. You know, we work with our members. We have 250,000 members worldwide, and we work with a range of communities and land managers and landowners on a day-to-day basis. In terms of our own estate, we manage a whole range of sites throughout Scotland, well, the UK, but specifically under my kind of watch in here in Scotland. And they range from urban sites right the way through to ancient semi-natural woodlands that we have across Scotland. I guess the jewel in the crown that we have is our Glenfinglas estate, which is 5,000 hectares of both a working farm, a profitable working farm, ancient woodland, and covers open ground, including 200 hectares of peatland restoration, which is covered under the peatland code now. As an organisation, we also provide an outreach support. We have 13 outreach advisors out there helping and supporting individual developers and communities of interest. The next one will be our carbon agreements. What we've basically developed are 2 arrangements, 2 agreements. The first one is what we call our standard agreement, and that's a simple retail transaction. The Woodland Trust will be involved in developing a scheme with a developer, creating it right the way through from the planning stage. We would see that through the process. We would buy all or a high percentage of the units that are generated through that scheme. We would cover all of the woodland carbon code administration requirements and cover the costs of those. And that would go on for 100 years. That might be the length of the agreement. So what that does is it builds up the relationship between the Woodland Trust and the developer and their successors. So it maintains that interest on both sides. The next agreement is a lease arrangement where the Woodland Trust will basically lease a piece of ground, become essentially the guardians of that piece of ground, and undertake all of the management on that site. We'd apply for any and all grant assistance that might be forthcoming. We would register the carbon. We would cover all of the costs of that development through that time, and we would basically sell that carbon on and cover our costs. So in effect, there's no outgoings from the landowner. The Woodland Trust would basically cover its costs and hand back an agreed share of the profits from selling that carbon on, and obviously hand back that woodland over a given period of time. So I'm just going to look at 3 different ways that we've applied those agreements. On the Island of Egg, one that Ailsa is very passionate about and knows all about. The Woodland Trust has been involved in the Island of Egg Heritage Trust for quite a number of years now, and we've basically worked with them through that sort of initial planning period, through the development of the nursery there, through seed collection, right the way through to planting up I think it's the first of the larger sort of woodland areas at Sandavore, which is 10 hectares of new native woodland. Now the Woodland Trust, through our standard agreement, we've registered and bought all of those units. And I think, and we can go into this later, and Charlie touched on it earlier. Through our due diligence process, we have worked out a way that we can assess people that we're passing these units on to. And this was very important to the trustees on the island of Egg, that their carbon wasn't just going to just any old company who were looking to greenwash what they were doing. What we have is a due diligence process that looks at a company's profile, looks at their journey to net zero, and understands where the carbon from the Woodland Carbon Code actually fits within that journey. And we have, through our agreements, an audit process that we can go in and just verify how that is working. The next one would be our lease agreement, which we've basically worked through with the Asset Foundation. At Asset, we've just entered into a 30-year management plan to create and maintain new and existing woodlands at scale. Here, the Woodland Trust would undertake a lease for an area of land, secure all of the grants, enter into that separate carbon agreement, and sell on those units, providing a source of income to cover the Woodland Trust costs and passing on the remaining balance, which is shared with the Asset Foundation. And what we've done there is we've managed to use that to embody a full-time employee to create these woodlands. So they have somebody who works for the Woodland Trust, but is part of the whole sort of Asset Foundation. So knows the sites, knows the community, and can react very quickly in terms of getting things done. The next one would be what we've done at Langham, which is a bit of a, kind of represents the way that the Woodland Trust can be quite innovative in our approach. When the first phase of the buyout was going through, we understood there was going to be a shortfall. So we managed to step in and bridge that shortfall on the understanding that when the Langham Initiative came to plant up an area, they would be in a sort of in a position whereby they could pay back that interest that the Woodland Trust had put forward through the generation of the new woodland and the woodland carbon units, and obviously take whatever profits that were over and above that for their own use. And again, this is another project that we've managed to work in a part-time employee in this instance. So half of this individual's time is working with the community down there to create those woodlands and engage with the local community to do that. The last thing I wanted to leave you with was what I consider to be our unique selling points. We are land managers. Charlie talked about credible partners, and I think the Woodland Trust is a credible partner in that respect. We know what we're doing. We do it on our own land, and we basically have a resource of specialists throughout the Woodland Trust that we can bring to a particular project. So it's not just the sort of local kind of manager that you're dealing with the Woodland Trust. Woodland Trust brings this huge sort of reservoir of expertise that can be brought to bear on a particular project. We're not an organization that's in this to make a quick profit. We will make a profit because we can sell units on at a slightly higher price because people want to buy units from us. Charlie was talking earlier about the landscape becoming slightly more sort of sophisticated in its approach. People want to know who they're buying units from as much as we want to know who we're actually selling units to. So we're in the business of using carbon revenues to make sure that projects will actually happen. There's a lot of people who are land rich and cash poor, and quite a number of communities will fall into that particular bracket. So if we can use perhaps potential future profits to make things happen up front, we can do that. We can also be flexible on payments, so we can we can sell on any units and set up a sort of payment structure that gives an annual income for a given period of time. So it's not sort of, you know, all the money up front. You know, we can spread those payments. And again, we won't pass units on to companies that don't pass our due diligence. And finally, this ongoing kind of relationship with developers, I think, is something that we're really very keen to make sure happens. So we might not be able to match the highest price going for carbon units, but what we bring to the party is this long-term association and covering the cost of that association. So we will do that registration, we will do the validation, and we will maintain that verification process right the way through the agreement. And that could be up to 100 years. So we maintain that strong relationship with any developer or their successors, which I think is hugely important. So yeah, looking forward to the Q&A at the end of this. So that's the Woodland Trust.
Brilliant, thanks James. That was really useful, and of course I'm obliged to say there are other professional agencies apart from Savills and other intermediary NGOs apart from Woodland Trust, but you know, we've really enjoyed working with Iona and James on EGG, and I know we've done work with Charlie's colleagues before, so certainly both organisations worth an initial chat if you're thinking about this. But as I say, there are other people out there as well. Now this will all be really familiar to Jon, because Jon's at the sharp end of speaking to communities every day that own woodland assets or thinking about owning woodland assets, and scratching their heads about what they should be doing and who they should be doing it with. So I'm going to pass over to Jon. Jon lives in Forest, and he's the CEO of the Community Woodlands Association, which advises, supports and represents Scotland's 200 community woodland groups, a huge number and growing every day. After beginning his forestry career as a harvesting contractor in the south of England, Jon's been working in Scottish community forestry since 1999 in a variety of roles, including 4 years as forest manager for Dunnet Forestry Trust and nearly 15 years in his current role with CWA. And I think what this shows is once you're in it for the long term, if you look at James and Jon's career path. So I'll pass over to Jon, who's going to talk a bit about the work of CWA and some of the things that communities need to be thinking about if you're interested in getting involved in this market. Thanks, Jon. Jon, you're muted, sorry.
If I unmute myself, that'll be good, won't it? Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Elsa. Thank you also, Charlie and James, who've, between them, expertly covered a lot, you know, the background and the process, which saves me having to do it. So hopefully I won't duplicate anything that they've already said, and I can focus a bit more on the support and the discussions that communities need to have and some of the key considerations and issues that they'll have to address if this is the sort of project that they want to get involved in. So it's kind of hoping that this will work. So very briefly, CWA, as Elsa said, 200 community woodland groups. We were set up nearly 20 years ago, and our mission hasn't really changed. It's supporting communities to achieve their aspirations, and that's not our aspirations, that's their aspirations, and representing and promoting them. And we do this in a whole range of ways. One of those that probably isn't stressed on here is the kind of peer-to-peer networking that an organisation like CWA provides. There's a huge amount of experience in those groups who've been operating for a long period of time. And we quite often facilitate collaborative projects with a number of groups working together. And I can see that being something that might happen in this arena in the future. Finally, at the end, we do policy and research work. And recently that's included, you know, me producing a paper for CLS on a lot of these issues. When I started 15 years ago, it wasn't part of my job. No one was worried about this. It's increasingly becoming a major part of the role. Not a bad thing, but it's how things change. These community woodlands, all across Scotland, pretty much every local authority area, huge diversity of types of woodland, communities, aspirations, and a whole range of tenure arrangements. Historically, I think there's been much more buying existing woodlands or managing existing woodlands, but increasingly because of climate change, new and existing groups are getting more and more focused on creating woodlands, and also because sometimes they take on associated open ground, quite often that's poor ground, and there's a fair bit of peatland restoration involved as well. And we're also concerned with the sort of broader issues around community benefit from natural capital. The community ownership mechanisms and processes that we've had to date over the last 20 odd years have tended to polarize things into community ownership versus private or public ownership. I suspect in the future there'll be much more scope for kind of mixed tenure models, and perhaps the mechanisms that help need to be refined and reviewed a bit to support that. In terms of how we, CWA, can specifically help support groups, there's a range of ways. The first is actually understanding and working out how to integrate all these various options, not just woodland creation, but peatland restoration, and the kind of growing world of biodiversity offsets, and perhaps there will be additional nature-based solutions available. Making sure they all work together in a coherent way for that community on land they already own, or perhaps that land they're looking to acquire in one way or another, is quite a big task, and it's something you don't just make a decision and go. There's also the navigation of the kind of pretty complex processes that get you from thinking about it to actually implementing it. In some ways, registering for the Woodland Carbon Code is the easy bit after going through the Forestry Grant Scheme, as anybody out there who's tried that will know. And it's a fairly long and time-consuming process. A really interesting area for support is the options for actual community control of the whole process. This is really fairly scale dependent. If you're creating a pretty small woodland with not a huge amount of credits, then you are almost certainly better off as a community working with one of the existing project developers. And we have Savills and Woodland Trust in the room, and as you know, Elsa said, others are available. I think we have to kind of say, but you know, there's a lot of reputable people out there who would give a good deal, and the community would get a good deal working with them. But if you're a large community landowner and you might be considering doing these sort of activities on a very large scale, then there may be opportunities for you to take the whole process in-house, do your own marketing, selling and development. That's a complicated business, but it would keep all the benefits in-house if you can successfully achieve that. And we have had some discussions with a couple of community landowners about how they might go ahead with this sort of idea. And then finally, the developing the messaging. The whole world of carbon credits and nature-based solutions is one that's pretty controversial, probably getting more controversial. Lots of well-documented and in some cases well-justified concerns about greenwashing. And these can be very difficult for communities to navigate externally, but also within their own community if there are people who have strong views about that. So I think there's a need and a role for us and others to really support communities with making sure they're expressing what's going on effectively. I'll talk just specifically about woodland creation considerations. Obviously, it's something I know a little bit more about than peatland restoration, which is not something I have any technical expertise in at all. My strong view, and I think the strong view of most of the people I know in the community sector, is that we should be designing and creating woodlands for multiple objectives, not just carbon sequestration. There's a range of others, timber, recreation, etc. That's a fairly random order, and the order of importance will vary from community to community, and not all of those will be important to every community. But generally speaking, there is more to woodland creation than carbon sequestration. Unfortunately, for very good reasons, but unfortunately perhaps the carbon credit calculations for any given site, which reflect species and future management regime, tend to maximize the number of carbon credits you can generate from that scheme by promising not to do any thinning or felling work in them for 100 years. Now that might be appropriate for some very special sites or some very inaccessible native woodland restoration sites, but perhaps isn't actually most appropriate for community woodlands now or in the future, because it constrains not just what you can do in the first 10 years, but actually what your successors will be able to do in future generations. Personally, I find it a little bit worrying that about 50% of the woodland carbon code units registered so far are for no thin, no clear fell schemes. That suspects either we're kind of planting the wrong sites, they aren't usable for anything else, or that people are focusing on maximizing income from carbon over the other opportunities and the deliveries from woodlands. But particularly for community woodlands, I think it's important that it's really carefully thought through, that you create a woodland that doesn't constrain what your successors will do and leaves them a legacy that they're actually really happy that you left them, rather than saying what will generate the most money in the first few years or the first couple of decades. Messaging, I said I'd come back to this. This slide I did swither about including at all, because to be honest, it's quite depressing if you sit down, spend too much time thinking about it. Woodland creation, peatland restoration are fundamentally good things. There are places perhaps we shouldn't create new woodlands, but broadly speaking, they're very good things. And they're even better if we can use them as a way of delivering broader community benefits. But what we mustn't do, it seems really important to me, is to oversell this as being enough to save the planet. These are some stats that I've kind of pulled out of the greenhouse gas inventory, the last one available, which is for the year before COVID. And the net emissions from agriculture and land use is 22% of Scotland's emissions. Land use and agriculture is a massive problem, and it's, to be honest, the hardest one to solve. That number is coming down much slower than all the other sectors: energy, transport, waste, so on. We've got a big forestry sink, but actually it just about balances what comes from peatland. And that's a forestry sink that whatever we do is going to shrink in the next couple of decades, because it's based on all the planting that happened 20, 30 years ago. And what we're planting now isn't actually going to make any meaningful contribution for another 20 years, because anybody who's planted a tree knows it takes quite a long time before it gets to any meaningful size. So it's a really good thing to do, but please don't oversell it, because if you do oversell it, it will come back, I think, to bite you as a community group, and you will have those same kind of arguments about, or the same accusations of greenwashing that other people face. So how can we do these things to maximize their impact and their contribution, particularly by 2045, which is the target date? The first is actually really controversial. I accept and understand, but it needs to be done on the best possible land, not the worst possible land. That's actually where you make the carbon savings in the next couple of decades, is by having less cattle, sheep, doing less ploughing, etc., etc. The value of the trees will come in after 2045. Second, and perhaps this should have been first on my list, but is that doing a woodland creation project and selling carbon credits is a means to start a conversation. It's the start of the transition. It's not the be all and end all. It's not job done. It needs to be something that helps stimulate and encourage everybody in the community to change their behaviours in the way that we know that we all have to do. And everybody, unfortunately, including me, is not doing fast enough. I'm not pointing the finger at anybody else here, because I'm, as guilty as most, I'd have to say. And finally, insist that your buyers of credits are independently accredited. This is something that both Charlie and James picked up on. This is not something you can't, an individual community can't accredit the buyers, but there are increasingly mechanisms being developed by organisations to have accreditation schemes for buyers. It would probably be better if these things were mandatory and government insisted on them, but I can't see that happening soon, or at least quickly. So, I think you will need to make sure that you insist that your buyers aren't greenwashing, and that they genuinely are committed to meeting net zero targets. That's kind of as far as I was going to go. As I say, CWA, really very happy to help. Get in touch, that's my email and our web page on Facebook, and obviously, open to all community-based woodland organisations, but also all community organisations that think they'd like to be a community woodland organisation in the future. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, John. Thank you for that. And I prefaced Claire and James's presentations by saying that, of course, other organisations are available, but in fact, there's no other Community Woodlands Association. So I can heartily recommend going to speak to John if you're thinking about getting involved in this. So 3 really different presentations covering different aspects of this, and hopefully, I think everybody on the call probably understands how complex this is. There is an opportunity there. There are also lots of threats there as well to communities, and I think we've seen a lot of those threats being played out in the press in terms of what could happen if this market becomes completely uncontrolled. Now, I did have some questions in advance, but I can see we've got a couple of absolute crackers on the Q&A box, so I'm actually going to start with them first, and it sort of links to a question that I was going to put to John, but I'll ask all 3 of you. So my question to John was going to be, learning from the voluntary approach to renewables developer contributions, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't work. How do we ensure communities can properly benefit from their local carbon or natural capital? Is it time for a carbon tax? And then linked into that is Andy Whiteman's question. Current arrangements are all essentially voluntary and unregulated. They're only governed by contract law, and of course that then requires a community or another beneficiary to actually go to court to enforce it. Is there a case for statutory regulation of this market for a range of objectives? So I'll come to you first, John. So first thing, is there a case for a carbon tax, learning what's happened in the renewable contribution sector, and do we need other statutory regulation of this market? Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ailsa. Yeah, I think there's probably lots of lessons to learn from the renewables process. 2 obvious ones to me are that we kind of missed the boat early on, so a lot of early projects, got away without making any contribution at all. Even those that came in later, the level of contribution has been set at a relatively low level of the kind of gross income. And I think that's really deliberate, not to significantly inhibit the behaviour of wind farm developers. And that's probably a key issue for thinking about a carbon tax. And I guess that depends a bit on what you mean by a carbon tax. So there are 2 ways that it could be. If we're starting from the perspective that woodland creation and peatland restoration are generally public goods and things that we want to support, then is your carbon tax on those who do or those who don't? So I know the Jon Hollingdale Trust recently published a proposal for a carbon tax, essentially taxing large landowners on their performance relative to a sort of notional optional land management carbon balance for their particular land holding. So they were essentially taxing those who don't. The bigger the gap between the reality and what's considered possible, the bigger the tax burden, crudely. I have certainly some concerns about the specifics and the details of their proposal, but that is certainly one way to do it, and it would effectively focus taxation on those who aren't contributing, which is, I think, a positive way to go, because it's important that everybody does this, as the stats that I was showing in my presentation show. The other way to do it is having a carbon tax on those who do. In other words, taking a sort of top slice off carbon credits or peatland credits, or even possibly grants, or in that case, that's just reducing the grant rate. I think the danger there is you either do it at a very low level so that you don't disincentivize people from doing the public good, or in which case you don't actually collect a great deal of money, or you kind of take a big slice by a tax, and then that disincentivizes people, and it probably, unless you have lots of thresholds and exclusions, it's unfairly focusing on the people who really need the money because they don't have deep pockets and they're only doing a small scheme and the rest. So I'm kind of less convinced about that sort of taxing those who do. However, I think it's probably better to take forward a single carbon tax is not going to be the answer, in my view. I think we need a much wider sort of raft of fiscal and regulatory measures involving the land rights and responsibilities statement, perhaps backed up by public interest tests, so that there's a kind of expectation on all large land ownership that it should deliver community benefit. And that community benefit in some circumstances can be in cash. And sometimes that's appropriate and it's what the community wants and needs. So, but there are other ways that it could be joint ventures and taking, having a stake in the profits of a scheme. It could be shared ownership. It could be, we'll have this 1,000 hectares up here to do everything, but you can have this 10 hectares next to the community to do the affordable housing, the things that you really need in the community. So I would much rather have that sort of range of options rather than just saying, we're just going to take X% of this and somehow distribute it.
Brilliant, John. Charlie, I was going to come to you next, if that's okay, because you obviously mentioned in your presentation about good practice that you're trying to inculcate in some of your clients in terms of how they engage with communities. So have you got any, do respond to the question, but also if you've got any examples that you could perhaps share with us of where perhaps investors or owners have actually actively gone out and looked at ways that they can support communities, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilse, and I absolutely agree with John's approach to answering the question, and it's something that we talk about a huge amount, which probably won't come as a surprise. How do we, what's the best mechanism to deliver community benefit and demonstrate that community benefit? And we've sort of played around with a number of ideas. Just taking Andy's kind of question and responding to that, I think John's absolutely right. A carbon tax, a number of different ways of approaching it, and I sense that legislators will be disinclined to do anything to dampen the progress that's being made. There's an impetus here that to achieve quite a lot of land use change in quite a short amount of time, and that they'll be disinclined to do anything that will dampen it. And frankly, the comparison with renewables is an interesting one. At the moment, carbon prices are simply not at the level where you're comparing apples to apples when we talk about that kind of model, which is not to discount the model at all. I think when carbon prices rise, that'll be something that we'll have to consider as being a very good mechanism. But at the moment, compared to the 35% margins that were being made on renewables, the margins that are being made on these schemes are frankly peanuts when you consider the fact that you are taking pieces of land out of any value creation potential forever, and you're getting what looks like a big lump of money, but it's spread across 100 years. So we're not quite at the point where a community interest of a kind of lump sum, I think, is necessarily appropriate. But I think we could potentially be a bit more innovative here and think about whether there are local businesses who could benefit from being carbon neutral through benefiting from the offsets that are created in the scheme, or supporting local businesses in their sustainability aims through involving them in the benefits that the schemes are able to deliver. There are things to think about here that maybe would be appropriate in some places. And as we know, we're talking about such a varied landscape of different types of community, different types of land, different scales, but certainly things that we need to consider. And in terms of whether or not it should a tax should be on people who are failing to meet certain standards, or whether it's on people who are actively participating in a carbon market. And from a farm business perspective, kind of the other half of my work is encouraging farm businesses to make sure that they're covering their own backs in terms of their liability, because it's likely that they will increasingly, whether it's through supply chains or whether it's through government legislation, both need to report and need to be seen to be neutralising their impact on the environment. So it's something that all rural businesses need to be thinking about, all landowning organisations need to be thinking about, understanding their liability and making sure that they're covering their own backs before they start entering into any kind of marketplace to trade anything. So that's certainly a consideration. In terms of public interest tests and what we are trying to work with people to do and to deliver community interest, it's a really, really interesting area, and no two sites are the same, but looking at social impact, setting out metrics of social impact that then follow the scheme over time, rather than focusing, we know that there's statutory consultation requirements for both peatland and forestry schemes, woodland planting schemes. I don't think they go far enough. That's my personal opinion. And I think that that's the lowest common denominator that we would encourage anyone that we were working with to do in terms of engagement. But also it implies that there's a point at which engagement and consultation needs to happen. And then once you've done that, tick, that's the end of it. And actually these are long schemes and they're going to change over time. And there needs to be an ongoing metric, there needs to be of community impact, there needs to be ongoing effort, there needs to be a recognition that there's ongoing work that needs to be done. And some of the people that we work with are considering employing local people as community engagement officers over the time of the scheme to deliver that work, that ongoing management. And that's maybe a privileged position of people who are able to do that, but it just shows the importance with which people are taking it. And with our encouragement, because this is going to be really, 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 really important within the political climate, but also if they're trying to demonstrate that they're not being part of a cynical kind of greenwashing scheme, and they have a real interest in contributing to the rural economy.
Brilliant, Charlie. And actually, you picked up a couple of the points there. So Nikki has asked, will the land sector need to keep land aside to inset their own residual emissions? Which I think, yes, communities certainly need to be considering that. And obviously, you're advising your own clients on that. And then David Tollick has said the community outcomes in relation to their own land are surely in relatively safe hands if the communities are canny, which is fair enough. But how are the community outcomes of the private transactions that you're talking about there assured unless we have sort of a strengthened land rights and responsibility statement or some sort of scorecard which you can measure those outcomes against? And that perhaps comes back to Andy's point about, do we actually need regulation because you're always going to have good landowners, as you say, who are keen to do the best for their local communities, and then you're going to have the sort of speculators who are just in it for the money. And it's a shame that everybody gets tarred with a brush, but sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that maybe Andy focused on the freedom to contract aspect, and freedom to contracts, commercial contracts is very, very common, actually more common than the more regulated areas in agricultural tenancies and things like that. And I don't think we should necessarily be afraid of freedom to contract. It's very common outside of the rural sector, certainly. But I do think that I'd be surprised, and I would, if possible, try and support and help in any way I could some guidance, whether that be from the Land Commission or from other bodies around good practice, and they're already doing that work, I know, and I've contributed to a number of consultations of work that they're doing behind the scenes to put that together and make sure that it reflects what's actually happening on the ground. And wouldn't be resistant to that at all. I think that's absolutely vital.
Brilliant, thanks, Todd. So James, you're involved in this market on a day-to-day basis. You're working with communities. Do you think there's a need for more regulation, or do you think it's working fine?
I think, well, as an ex-civil servant, I know that changes to regulations take a hell of a lot of time, and I think there are things that we could be doing in the interim. We probably do need that change, but you know, there are changes that we could look at, and I think what we'd like to see is perhaps more discussion around community benefit being a condition of something like the forestry grant scheme, for example. You know, you have to do certain things within your sort of development area, and that could lead to some pretty innovative type of approaches. I mean, you talked earlier about, you know, if we had 1,000 hectares, could 200 hectares or 100 hectares be given to the local community to do with as they see fit? It's actually something we're doing up at a property called Culdoran up near Ben Shieldig, where we're looking at a piece of land that we can do some community housing on there. We're talking to the local Community Housing Association, you know, to benefit the wider sort of community, but to make that a requirement of something like a forestry grant scheme over a particular size would be really quite interesting. I mean, the idea of a public interest test for land purchases over a certain size has got to be looked at. I mean, huge amounts of money coming in to buy land that, you know, 3 or 4 years ago would have hardly registered, and now it's going for millions upon millions. It's quite, yeah, it's an interesting sort of situation we find ourselves in. But also, I mean, the Just Transition Commission just published 24 recommendations. I mean, that's a sort of driver that we need to sort of get into that mechanism to make these things work, because they link straight back to existing policies, and you know, it's something that you know, you're not starting to sort of reinvent something or bolt something else on. So I think we look at what we've got in terms of a current regulation, see how we can adapt and improve that with a weathered eye on actually implementing change at that sort of scale and at that sort of level.
Brilliant, thanks, James. Something else that's come up in the Q&As, sort of a theme, is at a really high level. Is there a risk that offsets that are created in Scotland? We know there's not going to be enough land in Scotland and possibly globally to actually deal with all the offsets that we think are going to be required to get to net zero. But if we're looking at Scotland in particular, we have a specific net zero target. But if we are starting to sell offsets to potentially credible organisations, but from emissions that are actually made elsewhere, and we've got a suggestion here, carbon credits are traded internationally. This is from James. So it may be that a Belgian steelworks benefits from the offset, not Scotland, but we need the sequestration in order to meet our targets. So again, is that the sort of thing that could be dealt with by regulation, or is that something different again that Scotland as a whole needs to think about how it's going to manage that? So I'll come to Jon first. And Jon, I saw you've got your hand up as well. So if you want to make your other comment too.
Thanks, Ailsa. So yeah, I was going to try and come in and just say on the regulation. I mean, I think if you're doing woodland creation, then actually the major regulator for this is Scottish Forestry, almost certainly through the Forestry Grant Scheme, unless you're Forestry and Land Scotland, of course, you don't go through the grant scheme. And really, it's down to the government's appetite through their regulator to how fiercely they regulate new woodland creation. Where I think there is an issue with the regulation of carbon credits and the grants is that they tend to focus purely on the piece of land that's being used for the specific project and don't look at the totality of that land holding. So a landowner who's, you know, trashed some peatland and is now getting money to restore it, the focus is on that and not actually on what they're doing in the other 5,000 hectares of the land holding, where they might still be muir burning and having unsustainable deer numbers and so on. So there is definitely a need to develop that regulation, I think, to look at holding scale rather than simply project scale assessment. In the particular issue, as it stands at the moment, the carbon credits generated in the Woodland Carbon Code, and I'm pretty certain in the Peatland Code as well, are only supposed to be used for domestic Scottish emissions. There is a completely separate market that's about international trading, that's essentially comes from the Kyoto agreements, and other people are more expert. I suspect Charlie knows a lot more about this than I do, but there are two separate markets with different prices, and they quite often are confused. But the stuff we're talking about here is voluntary and it really only usable for domestic. It's UK, not Scottish, but it's essentially domestic emissions.
Okay, thanks for clearing that, John. So that's always been a thought of mine as well. Charlie, did you want to come in there and add to John's points?
Well, really, just to reiterate, yeah, absolutely. If you're, it's UK based when we're talking about the voluntary carbon market. So we certainly haven't been approached by or been involved in any agreements with non-UK based organisations. And actually, I haven't been involved in any partnerships or agreements that haven't been with Scottish based organisations. So that hopefully will put people's mind at rest. John's absolutely right. There's the compliance market, which is then wider and incorporates global emissions. And for global companies, they're able to draw on units from around the world. And there also just doesn't seem to be an appetite really for when we're talking about these kind of really high quality organisations that may be potential partners for organisations within Scotland. As soon as you sort of drill through the due diligence, they're not looking at international credits. They're not often looking at carbon avoidance, which often international credits are. They're to do with restoring woodland and maintaining woodland that already exists, which has a huge value, but whether it'll stand the test of time in terms of offsets, we're not quite sure. They're looking for sequestered carbon, and actually, not to throw a curveball into the discussion, but that puts a question over peatland carbon units, and I'm always very careful to warn people that while it's fantastic that we use private finance now to facilitate the restoration of peatland, and that's something that Scotland really needs to do in order to meet their climate agenda, whether peatland units will stand the test of time on the basis that they are carbon abatement units rather than carbon sequestration units is something that people who are taking their due diligence very, very carefully need to consider. And for some people, that will mean stepping back and saying, actually, although peatland units are easier to obtain a lot faster, and on the basis that a lot of people have net zero targets that are 2035, 2040, 2050, perhaps that they've made without necessarily going into enough detail about how they're going to achieve those. The peatland units can look very attractive, but they need to be very, very careful that they fall into the category of compensatory units and should be reported as such, rather than offsets, which is only really achieved at the moment by sequestration through woodland.
Brilliant, Charlie. Thank you for explaining that. And I think that just sort of demonstrates what a hugely technical and complex subject that is. I'm just going to come back to the point that Graham Craig's made in the chat, that there seems to be a risk even within the UK, because of the UK market, that Scottish offsets are sold to customers in England and therefore lost to the very specific Scottish emission targets, which I think is a point to make. So coming back to another couple of the questions, and I think it's a theme that came across in all three presentations, is around how we create better partnerships. And James Curran has talked about landscape, national landscape wide schemes to connect habitats to ensure that we get the ecosystem benefits that we're all looking for here. And we know that's only going to be done through partnerships. We've also talked, and James talked about the sorts of partnership that Woodland Trust can have with communities, and are there opportunities for joint acquisitions between private owners, community owners, NGOs, other public sector, to actually come together in some sort of joint venture, and everybody bringing their own skills and resources. So I think James mentioned, you know, perhaps at Kildare and the community are very interested in housing, whereas the Woodland Trust are very interested in something else, and there may be somebody else who's interested in delivering something else. So what do you see? Do you think those sorts of partnerships, either at a very local scale on a particular estate or to a much broader scale on the landscape scale, are feasible? And what are the policy barriers stopping those from happening, because they're not happening now? So I'll come to Jon first, and then perhaps to James, and then Charlie, just to give you a bit of time to think about it, but no time for Jon to think about it, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry, Al said my sound dropped out for about a minute there, so I missed your question entirely. Can you ask the others, and I'll try and work it out from that? Sorry.
All right, it's policy barriers to partnership, acquisitions and management, Jon, that's the question. So, okay, I'll come to James next, because you've been involved in various partnerships, but are there things that you would like to do more of that actually you can't do at the moment?
Gosh. What a question. Yeah, there's always things we'd like to do more of, you know. I mean, we're aware of the sort of the sort of repopulation debates that are going on in Scotland. Obviously, we could use partnerships to actually get more sort of rural jobs going, make housing available. You know, when we buy an estate, it generally comes with a big house and a fleet of cottages that are normally held for, you know, holiday lets. You know, can we use those to actually, you know, get people to actually live in them and work on the land that's surrounding them? That would be rather nice. In terms of partnerships, you know, we have a knock on the door nearly every day with somebody wanting to partner with the Woodland Trust to get a particular project either off the ground or, you know, to move it in a particular direction. So I think in terms of the opportunities are there, it's just a case of, you know, meeting the various sort of criteria of these different other bodies, you know, where you're getting somebody who's desperate to get, you know, X amount of carbon units by 2040, you know, saying to them, well, okay, if we bring in such and such, they're going to need their share and we're going to need our share. And, you know, it starts to become a bit of a sort of, you know, the pot gets smaller and smaller every time. But I think where there's a will, there's a way. And I think if you're innovative in your approach to these things, and it's not a sort of a money drive, you know, you can make things happen. You know, you can bring people with you, and you can include people, and you can go out and bring people together with this. I mean, it's a fantastic opportunity. You know, we shouldn't look at this as, you know, as a disincentive. This is a complete and utter incentive to use that money for the good, you know, for the wider good. We're perhaps in a lucky situation that we don't have shareholders that are knocking on the door looking for profits all the time, and we can basically share those benefits. So that's kind of where we're coming from in terms of the Woodland Trust.
Brilliant, James, thanks. So Charlie, barriers to more partnership working.
And that's a really interesting question. And actually, it'd be easy to say, oh, there are lots of policy barriers to partnership working, but the main barrier is the will and people being enthusiastic enough and getting to talk to each other. And that's always been an issue in Scotland, particularly up in Scotland, people talking to each other and collaborating. I don't think that there are any credible barriers to it, actually. The only thing I could think of that I've noted down is that there's really, this is not something we've touched on yet, but again, just to throw a cat amongst the pigeons, the uncertainty around agricultural subsidies and the future of agricultural subsidies. That means that quite a lot of land managers are just holding back and not wanting to commit to things, and that probably is a barrier to people participating actively in partnerships, and it would be fantastic to get some clarity on that. I think the main barrier to people working in partnership, and I'm involved in a couple at the moment which are proving to be really, really interesting, whether they're joint grant applications or whether they're their collaboration over these private funding schemes, or whether they're just collaboration because it's the right thing to do over land management. The barrier is the will, and if you've got the will, then there's a way.
Brilliant, thanks Charlie. I see Andy's put a question for you in the chat box, so I'll let you answer that in the chat if that's okay, about peatland versus woodland. I'll come to you, John, then, about barriers to communities being able to be involved in more partnerships.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts, one of which is just echoing what Charlie said about having a lot more clarity about where we're going with agricultural subsidies and the replacement and reform of that, and perhaps some of the wider fiscal measures, because I think they encourage inertia generally, and the fact that everybody's sitting and waiting to see what happens is actually slowing things down even more. So that's really important. From the community side, I think, yeah, as I mentioned, the mechanisms that we have to support community ownership are very, very focused on community ownership, and they kind of exclude other options. Up until now, the Land Fund hasn't really supported communities working under a lease or under other arrangements. So I think having a broader range of sort of support for communities, even if it's only at the initial stage in the sort of technical assistance that you might need as a community to go into that partnership, because you're not likely to have that sort of expertise in-house. If that was available to communities looking to work with landowners or others in partnership, rather than it has to be focused on communities buying the land, then that would help from kind of air perspective at our end to help people move forward.
Okay, brilliant. And I know I'm supposed to be impartial, but I must say I do agree with James. He's put in the chat, sorry, but we're in a climate and nature emergency. Just hoping partnerships happen. No, not enough. I think, yeah, we need to be much more proactive, and we need to be calling on the Scottish Government and everybody and their dog to say, right, okay, how do we get more of this? Because I think what we've heard today, some really fantastic examples of what can happen. And Charlie's talking about all the good stuff that's going on with her clients, and James and Woodland Trust, and John's got lots of examples of where communities are dipping their toe in the water. Some communities have dived straight in, like Langham and Assynt and Egg, and Drew has made a point on the Q&A that there's been less community engagement so far in peatland restoration. I think there's probably, from my limited knowledge of that, a whole range of reasons, some of which will be round, you know, the sort of landlord-crofter tenant relationship on a lot of estates that have got community-owned estates that have got peatland. But I know they're doing some great work in Carloway looking at this. So hopefully some of the results from the Carloway work will help to inform communities about how to take that forward. Now, I'm conscious we're almost at the end of time. Charlie's answered Andy's question, so do go on if you want to know what the answer to that question, woodland versus peatland. I think I've got one final question, which I wanted to pose to you all. I've heard of this phrase charismatic carbon, which I think is fantastic. And it's about what's the really exciting, interesting, lovely carbon that everybody wants, and how do you value it? So I'm going to come to James first. What do the really big, glamorous, glossy companies that have got lots of money, what sort of carbon do they want to buy?
Well, I knew this question was going to come up, and I'm regretting now writing down an answer to it, Ailsa. But I mean, in terms of charismatic carbon, I mean, I think you have to reflect on where corporates and where people were buying carbon were maybe a year ago. You know, they would lift the phone and say to me, right, I need 1,000 units. What have you got? I say, I've got 1,000 units, here you go. And they would go away happy, and we would go away happy. Now they're coming to us and saying, right, we need woodland carbon units that are going to mature between now and now. I want to know the vintage, when they're actually going to mature. I want to know this, that, and the other. And we can do that. We can give them that. But what makes them really, really get excited is when you say, well, actually, what we can give you is carbon plus. Carbon plus is all the environmental benefits, all the community benefits, all the social economic benefits that come with this particular proposal. And they're amazed that our woodland can provide all of this, you know, not just that sort of carbon sort of number, that financial incentive. So it's all of these things. And I guess scale comes into it as well. You know, we talk about sort of crofter carbon. being rather sort of charismatic in its sort of appeal and nature, and then you look at the romance and backstory of the whole sort of crofting in the Western Isles, and you build a picture like that. And I think on a small scale that kind of works at that sort of level. But I think people are becoming far more sophisticated. The carbon code, the carbon arena, is pretty immature in terms of its development, and it's just now starting to realize what it is, what it's got, and what it can actually be with all of these additional bits and pieces that are added on.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's that sophistication, I think you're right, that's entering the market that enables, I would say, communities to really have a great offer to make. So Charlie, what's your thought on that Carbon Plus and what that looks like?
I think we've got to look at it from the perspective of the people who are seeking these units, and actually, and as I said at the very, very beginning, this is a way for consumers and members of society to vote for the kind of land management that they want, but also the kind of society that they want. And the reason why sustainability targets for corporates and institutions have evolved into corporate social responsibility, which have then evolved into environmental, social and governance targets, is because they are recognizing increasingly that their stakeholders are demanding more and more of them in terms of their contribution, and that goes way beyond sustainability. Sustainability really is a very small part of it, and we need to be responding to that. Thanks to David Attenborough and other spokespeople for nature, people are getting increasingly interested in natural history, they're getting increasingly interested in the environment, they're getting increasingly interested in our native wildlife, and we're responding to a demand here. And isn't that fantastic? Because I think that the people who were, like James said, who were being phoned up and being asked for 1,000 tons of carbon, like their hearts sank. I mean, my heart sank when it sinks still if people ask me that question, and then I end up having to tease out of them that maybe they want a little bit more than that, and maybe they'd be interested in thinking in a little bit more of a sophisticated way. But because that's not, we're land managers, and we see this on the ground. We see what needs to be done to improve our habitats and improve Scotland's wildlife, Scotland's landscapes, and Scotland's rural economies. And we know that it comes down to way more than just tons of carbon. And so isn't it fantastic that people are asking for that, because we can deliver it?
Yeah, brilliant, Charlie, really well said. And John, just 1 minute, what makes Carbon Plus?
Well, I mean, I think James and Charlie have said pretty much everything I would want to say about that. They've really well kind of captured how you add value to your offer, and that should enable you to get effectively a premium price for the product. All I'd add is that I think community landowners, whether they are the owners or partners in a scheme, are in an incredibly good position to sell the broader community development benefits of the project. But it's not simply taking money for carbon, it's what you spend the money that you're going to get on, how that filters through the community and helps the broader sustainability of that community, is a really good story. And I think one that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time working on with communities to help them tell that story.
No, absolutely, John. Thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to ask Christina, there's some really fantastic comments coming through in the chat, just to keep those so we don't lose them, and we'll send them together with the link of the recording to all attendees afterwards. So Christina, if you're happy to do that, please. So can I just thank John and Charlie and James again for your contributions today. I think we've really made you earn your money this afternoon, and some hard questions there, but you all responded to the challenge. So thank you again for your time and your really interesting insights. And I'm sure this is going to be a topic, as you say, we're talking 100 years, so we'll be coming back to this time and time again. So thanks everybody for attending today. Hope you find it a useful session. And so we'll send out the recording if anyone wants to share that, and also details of the chat. So thanks again, everybody.